Hi, this is Patrick Major. First, a question to Alastair. I mean, can you explain a little bit more about some of the sort of fallout within the air staff after Churchill asked about why they blew down Potsdam? But also I wanted to know whether the Air Ministry knew that the Soviets were about to launch their final offensive. I mean, were the Russians at all asking for this sort of action, or was it just a kind of unilateral attempt by the Allies to help with what was happening? And then a question to Seb: were any Americans involved in this Operation Thunderbolt, or was this just a sort of internal piece of you know, an internal history, really, first draft of history? Just a follow-up. Also, did they know that they were going to hold the Potsdam conference, Alastair? Because this was one of the points about Churchill, is why are we destroying, you know, we're at the stage now where we need some intact sort of quarters.
Hopefully take something. Well, hopefully going to take something out of Germany rather than having to basically send supplies into Germany. I mean, it's almost like we're going to end up occupying a desert. And there is this feeling. Ironically, you mentioned the palaces around about Potsdam, which are relatively untouched. They really, it does seem like 1,750 tons of bombs end up basically in the inner city and the area around about the railways facilities. So it seems to be really centred on a relatively small part of a relatively small city, and the outlying palaces, the Frederick the Great Palace at Sanssouci and Park Babelsberg and it's the Cecilienhof for the Potsdam Conference, are relatively unaffected. On the fallout after Potsdam, you see various directives coming towards the end of the war. I think there's one particular directive. There's one in early May, but then it's really too late. I mean, Potsdam is the last sort of main force attack on a German city. After that, you get these raids on sort of specific targets. I mean, I know, Seb, you mentioned the other day there about the bombing still of Kiel and U-boat targets right up until the 2nd, 3rd of May. And on whether this came at the behest of the Soviets, I mean, you see, it's to assist the Soviets. It's to assist the Soviets. Did we know? I'm not 100% sure if we knew that the Soviets were going to mount the Operation Over the Oder on the 16th of April. I mean, the Soviets had been stuck there for about 10 weeks, so it was bound to happen soon. But I don't know if we actually knew the day that they were going to actually mount the attack on Berlin. But certainly the Potsdam operation certainly sort of softened up sort of one of the potential centres of German resistance to the Russian attack.
Generally speaking, the Soviets did not tell the Western Allies when an offensive was going to kick off. They didn't tell the Western Allies that the 12th of January 45 offensive was going to kick off on the 12th of January.
That's true. Yeah.
So, you know, it just wasn't the Soviet mindset to tell the Western Allies things like that.
Well, I think they were worried the West might go for Berlin themselves, but...
Yeah. As far as American participation in Exercise Thunderbolt is concerned, yes, there were American generals. There was an American admiral. There was American Army generals. The two American Air Force generals were Kepner and Quesada. They did make contributions. I didn't really have time to cover them. I don't, to be perfectly honest, think that apart from some discussion about, you know, the Pacific first and Casablanca's decision to put Germany first, I don't think their contributions were actually particularly enlightening, to be honest. But Tedder had invited them quite specifically. You know, he wanted US participation, and he sent copies to Spatz and to Eisenhower of the final product.
I mean, do you know if any of the Bomber Command people were invited to the conference?
I don't think anybody outside serving officers, apart from Zuckerman, and serving, all the other scientists were serving in some capacity with the Ministry of Defence or on an advisory body. Nobody that I can identify except Zuckerman was not part of the establishment at that time. So no Portal, no Harris, who was actually on a liner in the middle of the Atlantic at the time, but none of the other group commanders who ceased to serve. So no Bennett, no Carr, none of these guys got invited. Interesting, isn't it?
We have an online question for Seb. You talked about the earlier and later Richard Overy work. Could you just define which works you're referring to as the earlier and
later
later?
work is the bombing war, and the earlier work was the war economy in the Third Reich. Is that the title, I think?
Not sure. He covers in Why the Allies Won as well, doesn't he?
He does also cover it in Why the Allies Won, but that's a sort of broader consideration of Allied war making.
Okay. Any more questions in the room, or no? Back online then. Was there a punitive element underlying certain attacks, such as Potsdam? Alastair.
That's what certain German historians allege. I mean, you got that from the Jörg Friedrich, book. You got that from certain East German accounts as well. But it's just basically bombing it because it symbolised Prussian militarism. But there were definitely targets in Potsdam, as I've tried to say throughout. There were certainly. You've even got the local historian highlighting how it was such a vital railway centre for east-west transportation. You've also got this extensive network of barracks. You've got administrative, you've got party, you've got regional, and you've got evacuated headquarters and administrative bodies centred in the city. So there really are legitimate targets in Potsdam to bomb.
And the one operation which I think you can probably identify as being deliberately punitive was the USAF's Op Clarion, which was specifically designed to spread on a specific day, to spread the bombing through the Third Reich, to send a message to the German civilian population that we can go anywhere we want in your country, and perhaps you'd like to think about not doing this again in the future, essentially. I don't think Bomber Command really thought like that, because it had been bombing like that since the start of the war. So there was no philosophical difference in their perspective, I think you could say.
Okay, Gary?
A question for Alastair. In terms of what was known at the time, in terms of the rationale for the bombing, and my chronology is a little bit shady, but at the time of the bombing, or the planning of the bombing of Potsdam, Hitler was still alive. So it could, I'm proposing, don't know what you think, that it wasn't known that he was going to commit suicide in the bunker. So perhaps it could have been thought he would try to escape and stage some kind of redoubt in Potsdam, given that officials had moved there, together with some level of critical mass of the armed forces. I don't know. What do you think?
I think Potsdam was a relative safe haven because it had avoided direct attack until 45, other than that small American raid in the June of 44. And of course, you do have this idea as well as spreading in this last week or two, the last few weeks of the war, there's some Alpine redoubt down in the south, and possibly the Soviets helping spread that story as well, to just to push the American and British interest south while they concentrated on getting the prize, which in their view was Berlin.
Of course, is one of the reasons why they bombed Berchtesgaden. Other than, well, he might be there anyway. But Berchtesgaden, of course, is in the southern Alpine region, and so let's bomb out of the place in order to prevent him going off there to create his redoubt. Of course, one of the ironies of the bombing of Potsdam is that one thing it principally destroys, apart from what Alastair has listed, is the German army's First World War historical records. So we know a lot less about the First World War German army than we otherwise would, unfortunately, courtesy of Bomber Command. But there we are.
Yeah.
We've had a few comments about that online, which I mean, we can all sympathise and lament. I think we've all run into roadblocks in that direction, but there were perhaps bigger issues at the time.
Well, yes, preventing the German army winning a second time with.
Yeah. Question from for Seb, sorry. Will Sir Arthur Harris always remain the villain as regards area bombing?
Yeah, for some people, undoubtedly. He's an easy target because he never pretended he was trying to do anything else. I would simply make the point that area bombing was explicitly approved by the wartime British War Cabinet, which included, aside from Winston Churchill, it included Clement Attlee as the Deputy Prime Minister, leader of the Labour Party. It included Sir Archibald Sinclair as Secretary of State for Air, leader of the Liberal Party. So all three UK Democratic Party leaders explicitly approved the policy of area bombing. It was politically approved in a democratic fashion. Of course, Harris gets it in the neck, partly because he was absolutely unrepentant. Whereas, as we know, I think it was mentioned earlier in the conference, Churchill pointedly did not refer to Bomber Command in his VE Day speech, which did not go down well with the Bomber Command aircrews.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of the questions.
Mainly for Seb, because it touches on Operation Thunderbolt. Today, strategic bombing is a really emotive subject, and I think that's really apparent when RAF cadets come here as well. We ask them, we give them some of the facts. We say, "What do you think?" Very few of them stick their hand up and say they think we should have gone and bombed Germany from their perspective today. But I wonder how emotive it was when this exercise was run. Was there any sense that there was, this was the wrong thing to do when they were discussing it, or was there more subtle reasons for doing this which were really driving it?
There was no effective discussion of a moral element, none that I can find. And the published version, the discussion transcripts in the published volumes, of which there are several copies around the place in the National Archives, Historical Branch. I think the IWM probably has some in Cloughry's papers. Zuckerman's papers certainly have them. The transcripts are précis, but the original shorthand version is in an Air 8 file in the National Archives, and so we've got literally the shorthand takers version on it, where they wrote down everything, not always making a hell of a lot of sense, frankly. But there's no moral aspect or consideration or condemnation at all. There is consideration of whether area bombing was ineffective, as I've pointed out, quite a lot of consideration of that, but not from a moral perspective. And as you know, although there was the anti-bombing committee in the UK led by people like Bishop Bell and Stokes, one of the Labour MPs, and Shirley Williams's mum, that was not really the majority view of the British public, which was pretty much they started it.
Okay, we've had one more come in for Seb. What are your views on Tooze's findings?
What are my views on
Tooze's findings?
Well, I'm I generally am more inclined to support Adam Tooze's view than I am Richard's more recently modified view. He pays you money, he takes your choice. I think Adam Tooze's work is monumental in its research. Not that Richard's isn't, but he has examined the sources in minute detail, and the purpose of the book is to examine the whole of the economic and political structure of the Third Reich and the way they work together, so that it's not simply an investigation of the German war economy, although that is the core of the book, but it's an investigation of that in the context of the way the Nazis perceived things politically and operated in a much broader spectrum, if you like. But you can buy both books and make your own mind up, people. Why not?
Yeah.
They're only about 600 or 700 pages each, so quick bit of train reading.
Okay. So,
David Scott.
oh no, one more.
So, David Etchin, for Seb, what was the purpose of this this exercise? And could it have been that there was a group of officers who were deeply committed to area bombing and they had to be neutralized, or did they really want to kind of reinforce a particular story about transportation, or is it about a class conflict within the Air Force? I mean, you were hinting at some explanation to this, but I wanted to draw you out on it.
I think Tedder wanted, I genuinely think he wanted to let, he'd already done his Least Knowles lectures at Cambridge. I think did every senior officer in the Air Force, even though they were printed as an Air Ministry pamphlet, which they were, did every senior officer in the Air Force read Tedder's Least Knowles lectures? Probably not. But if you get them all in a lecture theatre for 2 days, you are able to put into their heads your perceptions as Chief of the Air Staff of the way you want to have them think. And he talks about, he wants the principles of air warfare to come out of this. That's his stated aim. And of course, according to Vincent Orange, he stated that he wanted to hit him between the eyes. But I think, as I said in the lecture, I think the structure of the conference was designed to produce a particular effect. And the people he chose, or who were chosen to make the presentations, reinforced that. I don't think he thought or felt that there was a sort of Arthur Harris clique still in the Air Force. The only thing you might say about that is that Cochrane was definitely, alongside Slessor, they were the two candidates to succeed him as CAS. But that's if you're going to say that the intent was to sort of put Cochrane in his place, I think that's probably going a bit too far. Because ultimately the choice is the Prime Minister's anyway. It's not the previous chief who necessarily chooses his successor.
So what's the key principle he wants to get across? Is it something to do with economy?
His final presentation just went on and on and on about economy, but he used the word economy to not just to talk about economy in financial terms, although he did talk about that and how in that post-war world, he didn't use the word bankrupt, but we know Britain was pretty much bankrupt. He did make the point that resources were not going to be plentiful. But he used that to say, therefore, we have to use them economically. And he really wanted to push that. He pushed it at the start and he pushed it at the end.
Thank you. So if we've had one more come in for Alastair this time. Would you like to comment on, did Potsdam set the conditions for the Cold War to follow?
That was the East German historiographical account. That was the angle that they took. That this was just showed how the Western Allies had basically adopted the early war tactics of the Third Reich, just these destructive raids like Rotterdam and Warsaw and Rotterdam, and now it was no different. You're getting these raids on German cities. So that was the argument, that it did show the Western Allies for what they were. And of course then in East German historiography, especially from the 50s onwards, it basically said both were different sides of the same coin. You had some East German historians such as Groller, who tried to be a bit more sophisticated than that, but still the East Germans did point to Allied Anglo-American destruction, certainly in Eastern and Central Germany towards the end of the war, and suggested this would mean that the Russians themselves and the East German state would then be a wasteland as well, not just the West.
Thank you. So, unless there's any more. No? Well, thank you both for some very interesting talks and questions. And back over to Harry.
Okay. You got that, Bonnie? It is on. Okay. Can you hear me now, Bonnie? Excellent. Well, as you can see, I haven't got any prepared notes, so I don't propose to keep you long with these closing remarks. What I do want to do is thank everyone who's spoken today and yesterday. I'd particularly like to thank those who submitted papers remotely, because they have had to cope with me boring on at them to give in videos, often at short notice. So I appreciate their patience. But thank you all for joining us, and particularly those who voluntarily chose to support the costs of the conference by making a £6 payment. It's made a real difference to allowing us to treat our guests to the style in which they're accustomed, which I think they've appreciated, particularly today. So a really big thank you. We haven't laboured the idea of supporting the conference during the event itself, because that's not what this is about. The research program at the museum is supposed to be accessible. And so I'm very pleased we've had something like 225 people, a large number live for every event. Very good. We'd like to get it for 300 by the time this week's ended. So do share it around, because as people watch the replays, that number will go up. And it means that we can definitely argue for doing as an engaging event as this again in the future. But if you do want to support the museum, there are options online. You can search for Adopt an Artifact, or you can just simply purchase some lovely items from our shop. But this is a time when smaller organisations in particular are struggling. And with Russell here as well, I'd like to thank the Royal Air Force Historical Society for funding some money to help support his research. It's a fantastic organisation. Their journals, up until relatively recent past, are available on our website. And I would say it's a bargain at £18 for membership. So if you do nothing else today to try and help support the historiography of the RAF, do join the RAF Historical Society. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us, our speakers again, and indeed our chairs. Thank you again, Stuart. So thank you all very much.